Hi, my name is Carver. This is also me. This is the one I stream with, the model I stream with more specifically. You can find us at Twitch, and here is the link to that, or at least the URL to that. We streamed all three games on there, and well, got most of the footage. I did some off-screen grinding and other things, but beyond that, it was pretty much all done on screen. I'd really appreciate any feedback you guys can give. This is the first of hopefully many retrospectives in the future, so I'd love to do more of this. If there's any specific games or any specific topics, I'd also be open to that. And if any of you have any specific information on Spectrobes or just want to talk about Spectrobes, I'll be in the comments as well. But beyond that, thank you guys so much, and enjoy the video. My early memories of this franchise are from well over a decade ago and came at the hands of my, at the time, best friend. We'd occasionally hang out at his house, and when we did, he'd like to show off various DS games that he had played, and would often lend me them. Spectrobes BTP, which is shorthand for Beyond the Portal, which is eventually going to get tedious to say, so I'm just going to shorthand it to BTP, just so happened to be one of those games he never got back. To be fair, I returned most of the games I borrowed from him, but I think I got Spectrobes BTP the summer he changed schools, so I kinda just kept it. I fell in love with the series from there at the time, however. I was too young and didn't have many means to do just about anything else, so I'd play it for hours on end. Spectrobes along with Pokemon Diamond, because Dialga is the superior legendary, obviously, became my de facto DS games. These two also paired well with Fossil Fighters, another franchise I kinda want to do a retrospective on. I mostly just want an excuse to play old games I'm kind of attached to. Anyway, you get the point. I really loved these creature collectors. When my family got the Wii, and I eventually learned of Spectrobes' origins, me and my brother played that, though we never finished for some reason. I'm almost positive that it had something to do with the boss on Bahamid, but I can't say that for certain. The series is something I always find myself reminiscing about, especially when I see Pokemon or Digimon. It stood out due to the designs of the Spectrobes, not quite as outrageous as Digimon's Digivolutions, which go from this to this, or as basic as some of Pokemon's evolutions. Most Spectrobes make their transition from cute child forms to their monstrous evolved versions quite well, and you can see their theme throughout each form. I mean, I just love them. Look at Villar and Segu, and I mean Shaken. Shaken is a fish with a knife for a head. It's pretty cool, and as it evolves, its knife just gets bigger. Their designs are still unparalleled. In comparison, we'll show off the most recent legendaries from Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, as well as the... Okay, so there's no Digimon equivalent of legendaries, but here are some of the final forms I can find. Then there are KO and Tindera, the two Ultimate Form Spectrobes we kinda know the most about. KO specifically comes off as more regal than Tindera, who looks like a feline hybrid with two giant swords and a hand for a tail, but still comes off as powerful, especially within the webisodes. Spectrobes is a game franchise that I believed failed largely due to its publisher and producer, Disney, or technically Buena Vista Games, who was a subsidiary of Disney. Now, the aim of this retrospective isn't to bash the aforementioned company, because they could care less about my opinion, and this isn't really about them, though they'll appear again obligatorily throughout as necessary. Another point of contention I'll state right off the back is that there are a lot of comparisons I'll be making to other games, as it makes it generally easier to explain or to illustrate various ideas in this, so apologies if you're not a fan of that aspect. I know some people find it abrasive in retrospectives. That all being said, allow me to introduce you to a video game franchise that Disney forgot, Spectrobes. Also, note, this is my first retrospective and video essay, so I'd appreciate any criticism or comments on how to improve, or even things you'd like to see from me in the future. A Pokemon killer. Apparently this is what Spectrobes was, or at the very least what Disney wanted when they were seeking to create their own original video game IP. The concept was pitched to Disney by Phil Barlow and Helen Meyer originally in 2004. According to what I've read from what Phil Barlow posted on his DeviantArt page in 2014, written loosely detailed out were plans for a more ecocentric game, with Spectrobes taking the role of an invasive species on an alien world. They serve strangely as antagonists in one way and tools in which to resolve said problems in another. You even have Rowland and Gina reprising very different roles to their current space police iterations. Rowland in Phil's version was a delivery boy whose ship got destroyed during a mission spreading the Spectrobes onto the alien planet, which just so happened to be Gina's homeworld, which also would have just so happened to be dealing with a different infestation of Kroll, a species which hardly resembles the current iteration of Kroll. Anyway, Spectrobes are called Spectrobes because they're creatures of light, i.e. the visible light spectrum, and would have used the 7 main spectral colors, like red, green, yellow, and the whole shebang, to represent a certain environment. Red was in volcanic environments, purple was Arctic, the yellow was desert climates, and while the others aren't explicitly stated, they can be extrapolated from their designs, such as green probably jungle-like, blue aquatic, go figure, and violet, or the slightly different flying purple creatures, are airborne. The only one I don't get is the orange. My only speculation is cave environments, though. The story, as lightly touched earlier, is among one of those that is completely unrecognizable from its final iteration in the games today. The Spectrobes before their arrival on Gina's world were biological tools meant to help terraform barren planets, and were remarkably capable as such as they had great adaptability to each planet's surface. Rowland was out delivering Spectrobes to one of his people's planets in need of their capabilities, but en route was shot down by the Kroll. The crash ended up spreading the Spectrobe seed pods. Note, in this version, Spectrobes were awoken from seed pods, not the fossils that we know, but were then spread across the planet. Rowland, however, was left in his cryogenic sleep for apparently hundreds of years while the natives worshipped him as a god, even going so far as to erect him a temple and calling him the Sleeping God. The Spectrobes in Rowland's absence had fought with the native species and brought many to extinction or near extinction. Their presence had also split the planet seemingly into clans based on one of the colors. Gina, who belonged to the Yellow Spectrobe clan, therefore was a desert people, and through meditation she can also see through the eyes of animals. Apparently after her parents, leaving to find the source of the Spectrobes, end up, out of curiosity, accidentally waking up Rowland. After learning about what happened with the Spectrobes while he was asleep, he's devastated by the destruction they've caused. He also learned that not only the Kroll kept trying to mutating Spectrobes, but that they've also enslaved his race, which I'm unsure whether this means the Kroll are spacefaring now, or if Rowland's people have come to the crash-landed planet. Gameplay was also vastly different, with you being able to play as either Rowland and Gina, with switching being a possibility, though there's no notes if the choice was one you'd be stuck into at the beginning of the game, or the ability to switch throughout the playthrough. Rowland was the combative type that we know him as, using the Spectrobes as combat agents, kind of as they're normally used in the games, while Gina opted for a more cooperative approach, linking her mind to the Spectrobes for puzzle solving and the like. Gina's non-violent approach went even so far as you being able to complete the game without engaging in a battle, which would have been interesting to see. Note, in this respect, I'm curious if this system would have played out similarly to Undertale, in which you battle, but your ultimate goal is to passively win said battle. Along with the two approaches, the Spectrobes would have adapted to the playstyle of Gina, and would exhibit softer features, while Rowland's would become visually more combat-focused. The best example I can think of would be Infamous's evil and good karma path, with Cole and his evil version becoming more slouched and aggressive, while his good counterpart stands tall and has a much more approachable demeanor. That's all speculation on my part, however. The game I just described, unfortunately, doesn't exist. This original Spectrobes game concept is so wildly different from the current iterations of Spectrobes that if not for the Spectrobe name, as well as the protagonist names, that I think you could have even called it a same property. This pitch came after 5 years of dealing with lawyers from Buena Vista Games, which was a spin-off, again, of Disney Interactive Studios. Despite Buena Vista's purchase, they outsourced the game's production to Jupiter, a Japanese studio. So, just to recap, the concept was sold by Phil Barlow and Helen Meyer to Buena Vista Games, who outsourced the game later to Jupiter, who then, for the third and currently final game, to a different game studio called Genki. Reading about the game's design and production, at least for the first two, since I can't find anything really about Origins, in what I read about Phil Barlow's experience, he discusses that they were completely cut off basically after the pitch. Despite being told by a producer that they'd be in contact with the pair, something that never came to fruition. Now, they mention a female producer in their statements, who I suspect is Miko Yamamoto, the senior producer for the first game, and an executive producer for the other two games. Still, despite my speculation, that could be completely wrong, as it's not clear whether it was entirely her sole decision to exclude Helen and Phil, or if it was made by Jupiter as a whole, or even Buena Vista's original decision. This game apparently was a big deal to both Disney and especially Jupiter. They were Disney's first foray into an original game IP. In fact, it's their only original video game IP. Yes, while they have Kingdom Hearts and Epic Mickey, Kingdom Hearts is the only other IP that they have that's anywhere close to original. And, well, I mean, it's very much not original, as it uses both Final Fantasy and modern and classic Disney characters to make a new story. But it's ultimately derivative of those two properties. Also, keep in mind I've never played either series because I'm not exactly a fan of Disney. Now, while I mentioned this was a big deal apparently for Disney, they certainly didn't treat the IP as such. Once again, using Phil Barlow's DeviantArt page, it's a great resource, but feel free to take it with a grain of salt. Disney didn't put the game in the stores or hardly ever promoted it. Advertisements of the game I can find on YouTube aren't all that good, to be fair, and, well, its most popular video is called the Spectrobes Roll Call, or this franchise's Pokemon Rap, which has 444,000 views, and that was made for the third game in the series, and has had 13 years to get to 444,000 views. Something that is no lofty achievement. I've got no idea how these ads affected the sales, but I would hazard a guess to say minimally. Speaking of sales, the first game is the 73rd most sold game on the DS, with roughly 1 million units sold. The second didn't sell as well. The figure that floats around for the first two games' sales together is 1.6 million, which brings the second game's total at 600,000 sales. The last game has a little unverifiable sales data, and the best figures I can pull is roughly 200,000 in sales. That obviously isn't good, and from what I can gather, this might be due to a lack of marketing on Disney's part on advertising the game, which contributes to the diminishing returns of the property. Most people from forums communicate that they had no idea the game existed, and to some extent even the second game. While there seemed to be a big push for the final game, it was likely front-loaded, and I can't find any TV ad spots for it on YouTube, though there was a small appearance at E3. The lack of marketing and sales leads to a few conclusions in my eyes. Disney had no real desire to produce original IP and didn't know how to properly develop video game IPs more specifically. The logic in this can be seen in most of the Disney video game properties released throughout this period. I will use Epic Mickey as our example for this, which sold 2 million on the Wii, using its well-established character, and had a big push by Disney. Now, the game sold great by all metrics, even with its reviews being just above average. It was apparently a big disappointment to Disney, though. A Kotaku article by Jason Schreier details the ideas Disney looked at with video games. Junction Point Studio developed Epic Mickey over 3 years after being acquired by Disney, and it was a fight apparently according to lead director Warren Spector. Disney had a closed fist when it came to budget, and since the studio was working with Mickey, they were even more strict with how the character would be portrayed in what was supposed to be a grittier, and for lack of a better word, edgier version of Mickey. Hype was drawn around by these leaked images, and were apparently what Warren Spector's team sent to Disney to see how far they could push the grit of the game. The studio was crunched then to completion, and Disney were evidently signaling that they weren't interested in console titles anymore. They bought a mobile/online game company called Playdom, and were making it clear they weren't interested in console games. John Pleasance, Disney Interactive's new head of the video game division, and the former boss of the acquisition Playdom, even stated, according to Spectre, and Epic Mickey Lead again, that he didn't think people who were making console games were going to have jobs much longer, and that the console games and PC games were not the future. I didn't know that till I started reading up on this, and now I have another reason I'm not a big fan of Disney. Also, a reminder that Disney Interactive went defunct in 2016, which brings me a little happiness, as well as the bitter reality that they still own Spectrobes. Keep in mind, this would be happening around 2009, and around when Disney's console transition would be happening. They had come to the conclusion, I believe, that Origins, being a console game, would likely fail preemptively, and did little to promote it or advertise its release beyond the bare minimum necessary, which they did create what I think were the best ads for the series, minus the Spectrobes roll call. They were likely already in the works, and didn't receive the proper reach that they deserved. The game, despite being the best in the series by those who played it, I believe, ultimately failed in terms of sales. So, all that to say, the game and its IP is still owned by Disney, and largely ignored by them. There hasn't been a peep about the franchise, and it's been relegated to nothing in Disney's IP list. In terms of video games, however, there have been talks about Disney going through indie studios and various other developers to reimagine their old IPs and, quote, to empower them to do unique things. I'm just not sure Spectrum stands within that version, but I believe it should. So again, my first experience of the series was Beyond the Portal, otherwise known as the second game in the series, which brought niceties that came from the developing and feedback process from the first title. They learned a lot. I'll be discussing the gameplay notes section, starting with the story. It's pretty lackluster, though Pokemon didn't have much of it to begin with, and rather still doesn't, actually. It doesn't make much with what it provides, though. You're quickly introduced to the four major characters, who are pretty much the most fleshed out by the end of the first game, them being Aldous, the wizened old teacher, Commander Grant, your stern but somewhat caring leader, Gina, your highly intelligent and snarky partner, and our MC Rallin, an airhead of a protag whose headstrong nature is one of his few redeeming qualities. That and his natural knack for leading the Spectrobes into battle. Rallin and Gina initially are part of the Nairo Planetary Patrol and are, well, out on patrol when they discover on Daichi a crashed vessel of Aldous, the Spectromaster of the Giorna system, which has been destroyed by the Crawl. Rallin is then attacked by the Crawl in a black vortex and accidentally summons the Spectrobes from a device called a Prismod. Aldous then reveals his homeworld is gone, pretty much, and escapes in hopes of finding more Spectrobes to fight the Crawl. He happens to find Rallin and Gina, though. Note this is one of the rougher areas, as we never really feel or see the impact that Aldous has with losing everything, really. Together, Rallin and Gina end up doing whatever they can to stop Nairo from befalling the same fate as the Giorna system. The rest of the story kinda isn't that important, to be fair. Everything kinda just falls into place after that. As interesting as the Crawl are, they don't really expand upon them to a significant degree in this game. The most we get is Leader Crawl, which are essentially stronger boss-type Crawl that just stand to obscure your path in the story, and the Zealous. Within the main story and lore we see is the introduction, though, of Ancients, or rather what was created by the Ancients. They made the Ancient Starship a moon which orbits Mido, the last planet of the Nairo system, which can concentrate light towards the planet. I'm assuming since it was the most likely to host a crawl sphere is why they constructed the station, but again, that is never specified. And then finally, they also had some connection with Doniphan, apparently. Another main point, which will be something we address further down the line, is how we received the series' first and only non-vortex related Geo on Genshi, Tindera's Fire Geo. Now, talking about Crawl, they are beings of darkness, consuming just about everything and seeking out how to destroy planets. In regards to keeping it relevant to the first game, they are propelled by that one goal to destroy the planet. They're monsters who act like an infection, which spreads throughout planetary systems, though we see later, that there is also a mycelic style of infection, exhibited by the Zealous, which are one of, if not the key part of any good Crawl invasion in my opinion. It's also interesting that Zealous heal things in general in this game, including Rollin and his Spectrobes, so it's entirely possible that the Zealous were originally corrupted by the Crawl to be used in their invasions. They're also alive and are capable of fighting back as well as creating more Crawl to fight or reviving dead Crawl, I'm not sure exactly which. It's the most lackluster game though, in my opinion, in the series. This is one of the weirdly interesting series though that consistently improves upon its formulas with each iteration of the games. So gameplay notes. The game is admittedly not the worst. Now, for the age of me and my experience with other titles, it suffers drastically considering the later iterations of Creature Collectors I have to compare it with, and even within its own series. The game is, well, a plurality of games within its main genre as a creature collector, so breaking it up into the overworld, the excavation, battle, and the awakening, which will be the order we go in for all three titles. The overworld in this game is the weakest of the bunch in my opinion, and serves mainly as a means to access the other types of games. You'll be searching with a child spectrum for minerals, fossils, and some sweet cubes. Later there are also these portals which you can interact with and enter to get geos, something else we'll talk about later, and technically you can access one before beating the game first on Nessa, but that's the only exception to this rule. You can also interact with the world at large in the overworld by NPCs. The NPCs aren't that great, but I mean neither again is Pokemon's, they just have a bunch of them really. Like I said, the overworld is just a vehicle really for the rest of the other parts of the games, and the best part of the overworld is the child Spectrobes, which follow you around and all have these neat little animations, including all the custom colors, which are the best parts of Spectrobes in my opinion. You get your favorite child Spectrobe and he follows you and helps you search for minerals and Spectrobes. I think if Follow Pokemon had more focus. Excavation is where you're going to be spending most of your time in the game, even if you have the Giga Tool which instantly excavates any mineral or cube that you've excavated before, but it instantly destroys fossils. There are a multiplicity of tools to use, but they all functionally serve the same purpose, to excavate and pick up items. So you can mine minerals, and in this game, there are several varieties of them. Primarily standard minerals which just raise a single stat, some are rare types which raise multiple stats at once, some which change the color of the Spectrobes, and one that just evolves a Spectrobe. These in particular were very useful in the making of this video because the requirements in this game for evolution are quite tedious. So as far as I'm aware, damage doesn't bother minerals too much. If it gets broken, and if it gets perfected, you get more excavation points. And cubes are the same way with one corresponding to each of the letters of the Greek alphabet. Now, as for fossils, your damage does matter, as the lower you get, the more likely you are to get a custom part, which is kind of important. Notably, parts range from a threshold of Minergy left, which I'm not 100% certain on the threshold, but you receive custom parts at 80, 50, and 25% Minergy left, with you receiving one part within the 80 to 50 range and a different one at 25%. Also, it should be noted that by using save states, I've come to the conclusion that the fossils you encounter are of two varieties. One that hold two specific custom parts, and the other holding the remaining two, but there is no way to tell them apart without having completed them already. To actually make this more clear, if you dig up a Bartopod in Area 2 of the Nessa Valley, you receive in the 80 to 50 Minergy left range the first evolved part, and in the 25% range you'll receive the second evolved part. But if you excavate it in Mido at 80 to 50%, you receive the second adult part, and at 25% will receive the first adult part. This, of course, however, is drawn from some brief observations, and I can't say this is definitively how it works, but it seems to be largely consistent from what I found. Time also isn't a factor in excavations, it's just counted for some reason. I'm not sure why, it may be a score bonus. Also, getting 100% on the fossil does nothing really for you but achieve the coveted excellence. If you get the aforementioned 100 and no damage, you of course get the 80% Minergy left, and it's really hard to get this excellence, I might add, because it requires almost, if not pixel perfect accuracy. Now, since I was emulating the game, I get two advantages, one being a speed up hotkey and a hotkey for mic blowing. Like I said, judging solely based on the first game, but this is one of the better improvements that the sequel makes of the many. This game, again, is the most pivotal of this particular entry, and you'll be spending a ton of time in it. Now, battles are one of the most divisive points to me in this game, as it's not enjoyable. The coolest part of battles is watching the Spectrobes do their thing. However, in battle you control 2 Spectrobes at your side and Rallen in the center. It's honestly the worst part of the game, because Rallen is basically useless, and if he dies, the battle is over, regardless of your Spectrobe status, which makes sense from a story perspective, but it's kind of frustrating. Battles themselves aren't hard, but it's all about positioning, which is frustrating because it's hard to do considering how Rallen moves and the Spectrobes target their crawl. Rallen, like I mentioned again, even if you have the top equipment, he's basically always useless and feels like a lead weight in fights, so you're just better off never really using him. An interesting mechanic in it is the fact that you have charge-up attacks, which function pretty good and will do a ton of damage for you. You also have these combination attacks which can vary in animation, as different type combinations end up resulting in different types of moves. I'm sure there's more to it, but I'm barely interested in combat as a whole in this title. Incubators are kind of fun. They're Pokemon Camp before Pokemon Camp was a thing, and it plays a hugely critical role to the improving of your Spectrobes and their evolutions in this title. Its implementation is rough in this, and well, it's still not bad, though leagues above what System Pokemon was doing for Pokemon interactions. There you'll be feeding your Spectrobes minerals in order for them to evolve, and well, some other minerals. You can also pet the Spectrobes, change their environments, and change their custom parts. While being one of my favorite parts of the game, I recognize part of the problem that it would have had on the original DS, as it uses time as a factor for evolution, which I'm of the staunch opinion that waiting as a mechanic in any game is never good, because it's one of the many things that you as an individual could never control. It's not as much of a problem now as well though. I can place the Spectrobes in the incubator and just change the time on the emulator, and it'll count as time passing on the emulated DS. The only problem I have with this version of the incubator again is the mineral loading is quite tedious. Awakening then now is how you get your Spectrobes to revive from their fossilized state, and there's 2 methods to doing it. The first one produces all the original colors and requires you to hit a certain range. I'm sure it worked better on the actual DS, but my emulator had me having to loudly hiss into a secondary mic I had. Not a great system on my end. The second way to awaken, in the much easier way, is color awakening. It allows you to activate and awaken your Spectrobes in the various colors. It's great, and you really get into it after getting a specific cube. It's really nice and really helps your Spectrobes feel unique. So overall, in this game, it's rough, but its charm shines through in a lot of areas. Rallen and Gina have a good dynamic, and the Spectrobes designs are absolutely fantastic for the DS, and I mean in general. The child forms are incredibly cute and amazing, adult forms are a nice middle ground of cute and cool, and evolved forms are just cool and ferocious, which is what they should be. The incubator also helps you learn more about your Spectrobes, which is fun, but certainly needed to improve in the future if it ever wanted to succeed. Beyond the Portals is an improvement on just about every part of the formula that the first game set out, which, I mean, wasn't that hard, admittedly. The game is leagues better, and albeit could have used more development, but I'm not expecting anything too grand from it. Like I mentioned before, this game was my first experience with Spectrobes initially, given to me by my friend, and well, I loved it, which brought me to the third game, but never again back to the first. Rallen and Gina feel much more like partners in this, that Gina gives Rallen a hard time, and Rallen is absolutely headstrong throughout the entirety, despite having and constantly being met with the fate of the universe and humanity as a whole. Gina and Rallen's dynamic is also really fun, once again as they bicker, but you can tell they really want each other to succeed. It's also clear that Gina wants to become a Spectrum Master to some extent and be more involved with the Spectrobes as a whole, rather than just coming off as Rallen's partner. What makes me curious though is that the game was released a year and a half after the first release, and the amount of improvements, I wonder about the first game's development. Spitballing here, but the first I'd say was a rush job, given that later we find out by an interview about the development of Epic Mickey that Disney wasn't too pleased about how long it took to develop the game. It's entirely possible that the first game was rushed out to meet Disney's demands, and that this was their way of meeting said demands. Just spitballing ideas. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's move on to the story. Starting off the gameplay notes, again, we'll be going to the story, something that I didn't do for the first game because the story wasn't admittedly compelling in the slightest, and this one, on the other hand, is quite different and well bolder. It feels much more focused in its scope and actually gives you an antagonist to root against other than just the crawl. Rowland and Gina are again in NPP headquarters when the place is attacked by a group of Crawl led by Maya, who manages to steal the ancient starship and escape to a different system. It was an almost perfect escape till Aldous blew up the ship in an act of defense and defiance. Don't know how certain he was about surviving himself when he made the initial decision, but he does it happily every single time it seems. So it comes out as no surprise that when he's confronted with his master being kidnapped and a new threat to the system, Rowland springs into action. Curiously though, he seems to have lost his own Spectrobes, which would have made most of the early problems in this game just about disappear, but that's besides the point really. There are reports of disturbances at several key towers on the various planets of the Nairo system, Genshi being their first visit on this trip. We then meet the first of the High Crawl, Jado, the first upper-ranked Crawl that Rowland has to fight that isn't specifically a leader Crawl. While Jado then successfully destroys the tower, he's then defeated by Rowland. Jado then slinks away after his defeat, and we're then introduced to the single best character again in the series, Maya, who shows up on Genshi just to mock Rowland and then to leave. After the heroic escapades of Rowland, we're given Aldous' tank, which was in a research base on Genshi, and a time, though, broken. Commander Grant then orders for Rowland and Gina to head over to meet with Cyrus on Nessa to help him deal with Crawl. Now Cyrus isn't at all concerned really of the safety of the universe or even his own planet, only that he will personally be affected by the destruction of Nessa. So he informs Rowland of the Crawl's location on the other side of Nessa in the Mineral Valley. When Gina and Rowland arrive in the Mineral Valley, they find the Crawl and upon reaching the new tower, meet a third member of the High Crawl, Gelberos. Gelberos does his job and destroys the tower on Nessa and opens up the first of the game's namesakes, a portal to the Fubuki system, a sunless star system that its lone planet, Hyoga, a planet of frozen Crawl, of which holds an army which Gelberos intends to release on the Nairo system and wipe out Nessa. There's a confrontation, of course, with Gelberos, and Rowland defeats him. Gelberos then collapses, and Maya once again appears out of nowhere. She of course ridicules Rowland, and also announces a twin assault on Cullen and her visit to Daichi to cause some unannounced trouble. While Rowland was supposed to make a choice of which planet to help, Commander Grant comes on the comms to make an order requesting that Rowland and Gina head back to Cullen to deal with the assault. The team deals with the assault and rescues a kid who doesn't get a name, but we'll call him Smurry. It'll make sense later. There at Daichi, we meet Maya once more, who initially asks Rowland to join her as she needs the power from a spectromesh to do something of which I don't know exactly, and in exchange she'll stop the Crawl from flooding the Nairo system. Now presumably this is in opposition to Crux, who seeks to wipe out the Nairo, or is a ploy to just get Rowland to leave and have an uncontested invasion of the system. Either way, Rowland, to my dissatisfaction, decides to reject Maya's offer, who then shows us one of the biggest threats to Spectrobes, Dark Spectrobes. The two clash and Rowland loses handedly, and unable to stop her, Maya destroys the tower on Daichi. As per usual, she then mocks Rowland, telling him the only way he'll be able to beat her is to use Dark Spectrobes himself. Defeated but determined, Rowland and Gina follow Maya through a new portal that the destroyed tower created. They enter the Kagero system and head towards planet Fons, which has a billowing funnel of Crawl which stretches up to the sky as part of what's called a Dark Look. Presumably it's what Gelberos had intended before being defeated, and is an in-progress invasion of Nairo. Gina then realizes that there is a strange satellite which hovers over Fons that has become activated whenever the lake apparently became active. The two then decide to investigate it rather than smartly realizing that fighting hundreds of thousands of Crawl wouldn't end well, as the NVP during the invasion on Colon struggled to deal with no more than 20, it seemed. Arriving on the satellite, it's evident that the structure once again belongs to the Ancients, as it uses the same stone we see in the ruins within the first game and the Ancient Starship. Gina, after letting us into the facility, translates a document that tells us that the satellite was built to stop the dark Spectrobes. After powering the satellite using Spectrobe fossils, we hit the dried lake with a concentrated beam of light, drying the lake and ending up hurting Maya in the process. Despite the immense pain she's presumably in, she somehow finds the energy to mock Rallin before retreating to another planet. Gina then informs Rallin that she's found the planet Darkmost nearby, whose swamps radiate a dark power. We then meet Gronos for the second time, the first being a brief intro glance in the beginning, who's stored a multitude of fossils in his stomach and scatters them about the swamp. This in turn turns the Spectrobes into dark Spectrobes, a process I'm unsure of is just as a result of Darkmost's unique environment or a corruption of the planet by the Crawl. Gronos then argues with Maya and asserts himself as the superior High Crawl since Maya was in some way defeated, though to note she's the only character who's canonically defeated Rallin. Also, during that argument, Krug shows up for the first time, literally says and does nothing before leaving. Gronos, being a complete moron, is just supposed to discard a bunch of fossils into Darkmost's swamps, presumably to turn them into dark Spectrobes, and throws out a crystal which does nothing for the story. It's just put in your inventory, and I could have sworn it was important. Apparently it's not, surprisingly. Maya then sets up a barrier at some place in Darkmost, which is only accessible if the person has dark Spectrobes. I find it strange that she'd also then tell Rallin that he can find dark Spectrobes in Darkmost, which seems like she really wants Rallin to join her. I wager Maya's intention was to let Rallin experience dark Spectrobes to actually convince him, but mistakes his intention and loses the fight, retreating once again. After returning to the ship, the two receive a transmission from Commander Grant, who commends the two's efforts and tells them to get some rest, but is then interrupted by Professor Kate, who informs the team that Tower on Ziba was destroyed a la part of Gronos' handiwork. Kate then informs Rallin that Gronos is consuming the magnetic fields surrounding Ziba's two moons. He fully consumes one, and I think partially or possibly fully consumes the second moon's magnetic field before fighting Rallin, and losing begins to spill out everything he's consumed, which seems like they didn't add enough because he's basically just dropped a dimensional coil, which is definitely not all he ate, but it's what Professor Kate needs, albeit this one in particular is broken. Come to find out that this also resembles something in the museum which Webster offers to donate to the fight, albeit with his usual argumentative nature. Also, Professor Wright has also calculated Aldous' coordinates, and their ship is fitted with a dimensional coil so that they can open up another portal to the Hakba system and locate planet Nox, a planet with a chunk hollowed out of it, with its core seemingly missing as well. Maya then stands there at the ancient starship's ruins and begins laughing how she took down Aldous, except she hasn't, and Aldous then threatens her with a geo, so she retreats fearful of the item. Aldous subsequently returns to the ship and tells Rallin and Gina what has happened to him, and that he learned of a new weapon to use against the Crawl, Dynalium, though the blueprints are on another part of the planet in ruins belonging to the Ancients, of course, which Rallin goes to explore and is then helped by Gina. Within the ruins are several locks which also seem to serve as computers or documents which kept some of the Ancients' notes. It explains that Dynalium is essential to fighting the Crawl, and that Dynalium harnesses energy from the sun, and all the Ancients also mention a he fighting the Crawl, something that Gina doesn't particularly like, and likely hints at her own ambition and desire to help fight the Crawl. Gina's handiwork allows Rallin to explore further and discover a Zealous. This Zealous presumably is holding Nox together, since it should have collapsed a long time ago, clearly. This Zealous, however, is under Maya's protection, and she reveals her Crawl form finally to Rallin. The fight ensues, and the Zealous heals Maya like it does to Crawl, though it doesn't heal the Spectrobes like it did in the first game. Maya cries out after being defeated, and the Zealous dies. A shine at a chamber below reveals the dynalium the pair have been looking for, and based on the notes received when we find the dynalium, it reveals that the Hakuba system was the original home of Aldous' people, who after a valiant fight fled to find a new home safe from the Crawl. It's also then proposed that more of the Giorno people might have fled their homeworld and are about some other system. The three then turn on Aldous' capsule, though there were some initial problems with its activation. We see in the Hakuba system a planet of pure darkness. Unlike Darkmost, the planet is so shrouded that it becomes evident that dynalium is needed to even enter the atmosphere to land. Just about everyone in the story helps with the construction of more powerful dynalium weapons to help destroy said atmosphere. And we also learn the importance of Nanairo is basically due to its white star sun, which acts as a deterrent to the Crawl and makes Nanairo a great threat to Crux. The NPP then launch a coordinated assault with 7 ships, each mounted with dynalium equipment to blast a hole in Malik's atmosphere. Rowland and Gina fly through the atmosphere and land on Crux's Dark Palace. Now, Rowland then foolishly enters a portal that he doesn't understand anything about, while Gina takes a more scientific approach to her visit, and chooses the opposite that Rowland does. Through some miracle, Rowland finds his way to a new chamber where he sees Jado standing behind a containment unit. Come to find out that Rowland only fought the Shadow of Jado, while he's been on Malik the entire time. The Shadow, however, has been following you and absorbing the powers of the other High Crawl that you've defeated, instilling said power within Jado. Know that it's returned and that it was Jado who apparently orchestrated you on finding Malik by putting in the coordinates himself. The two fight once more, and Rowland this time, facing the real Jado, wins. However, he slinks away and goes to Crux's chamber begging that he be given one last chance by means of a new body. Crux agrees and then ends up throwing him in a developing Crawl sphere, an ocean of pure Crawl which absorbs him, and he is banished to wander space for all eternity. Crux and Rowland then confront each other, with Crux revealing that once upon a time he too was a Spectrum Master and fights Rowland. The fight entails 2 creatures, Dolgan and Dolgon, a combination of Crawl and Spectrobes who, unlike Dark Spectrobes, which are merely infused with dark powers, these are actually infused with Crawl and dark powers as well, it seems. After beating the pair, a difficult task in itself, Crux reveals Kragon, a Spectrum Crawl fusion who is untouchable by the Spectrobes themselves, and is only defeated when the Geo that Aldous gave Rowland on Nox, i.e. Tindera, activates. Crux laughs as he realizes he's underestimated Rowland, and the two begin to fight with swords, and in a clean blow, Rowland slices off the mask of Crux, revealing a human face covered in Crawl. Crux is suddenly overcome with weakness, and flees, vowing to clash with Rowland once more, and disappears. Now after that, Malik supposedly disappears, but the endgame requires you to fight through a sequence of battles on the planets to retrieve the other Geos, and the dialogue of other characters treat you as if you've defeated Crux, so Malik's status, we'll say, is unknown. Now the story is leagues, and I mean literal leagues, better than the first, which is why I even talked about it in such detail in the first place. The problem is that it again leaves much to be desired, and if the world would have been more fleshed out in the future or in the books, I would be happy, but it doesn't. So let's move on to gameplay. The overworld in this is far better, taking a behind-the-third-person approach, and while the camera isn't always the best, it's serviceable enough and again makes the game far more enjoyable than the first game. Movement is fast enough that it doesn't become too tedious, though you don't get the jetpack as fast as I'd like. Personally, it takes you quite a while to get it, and ends up becoming one of the last few items that you receive. The overworld is now also filled with 2 types of vortexes, one which is always one type of battle, and are represented by smaller vortexes, and a second larger vortex which can contain anything from 1 to 3 fights, but are essential to clear the area and to excavate minerals, mystery stones, and access secret doors. The environments relative to the DS's abilities are great too. Vibrant colors, I really enjoyed the 3D models, and while it's again a night and day improvement from the first game. Excavation is again another improved facet, while largely the same system features much needed improvements with every pixel not being required for 100% excavation. It's such a nice improvement. Now, also with 100% in this game, you don't earn custom parts. Instead, you get a crown which can be used to awaken Spectrobes to the adult form without feeding them any minerals. This has to, however, be achieved in under 60 seconds to get this. Also, the requirements to pick up minerals and fossils have gone from 95 to 90%, which is also a nice life feature. It cuts a considerable amount of time down on mineral excavation, and mineral excavation is largely the same, along with cube excavation, though you can no longer receive dupes of cubes, which is a pretty neutral change, but makes it easier to collect them all and know that you get a new one each time. And then there are a new thing to excavate called mystery stones, which help provide you with several resources depending on their shape, which makes them kind of annoying in some aspect. There's a pie-shaped one which contains 5 random low-rank minerals, a piggy bank which contains 5 low-rank minerals, but they're all the same mineral type and mineral shape, a seed pod which contains 3 seeds and 2 minerals, a discus which contains 3 cruiser material and 2 low-ranked minerals, a treasure chest which contains 3 selling minerals and 4 random other minerals, and finally, arguably the most important mystery stone, since it contains the coveted custom parts, the dinosaur skull. And they're great since you get 4 at a time with them, but you can also get duplicates, and it makes it harder to find all, but gets annoying in some aspects. You have to clear out the area you're in every single time, as well as searching specifically for the skull-shaped mystery stones, which aren't always guaranteed. It's kind of annoying because you can get like 2 repeat parts and only be missing 1 in the particular Spectrobe you're hunting for. It also depends on the planet, because each planet has a set of fossils, and so you can only find the fossils on those planet sets and the custom parts there. Again, you'll be spending a lot of time in this minigame, and it's really good compared to the first game. Battles are also improved by being split up into overworld and encounter battles. Overworld fights are now just with Rallin and are fought using presumably upgraded weapons of the NPP, designed in some part to fight Crawl. You've got the 3 types: swords, gloves, and blaster doing what they did in the first game, essentially, though there is no combat timer. Also, when an overworld enemy is defeated, they have a chance to drop 2 types of healing orbs, one which either heals Spectrobes or Rallin himself, which is pretty useful in my opinion, and when Rallin dies, he's simply set at the entrance of the area you've entered. Then there are the encounter battles, which are the best part of combat in this game, as you're now in control of the Spectrobes themselves, controlling one specifically, and the other being controlled by an AI, which for the most part does its job comfortably, though some of the AI leaves something to be desired, but overall not bad. Giving control of the Spectrobes was a nice switch up, and the battles are fun, though still somewhat wholly unnecessary other than to let you excavate around the area. Boss fights with a high crawl are also pretty good, and seeing crawl forms are fun. The only battles I'm not the biggest fan of are the sequent battles at the end of the game, as fighting over 100+ enemies with only 6 Spectrobes is kind of rough. Also, not gonna lie, fighting Crux as Rallin while being a theoretically cool final boss encounter doesn't live up to what it should have been. Next is the incubator, which again has a hell of a lot of improvements, such as the ability to always access them from your menu and even feed them, though I don't exactly see the point of that, as you can do this on the ship and then actually retrieve said fed Spectrobes on that ship. But that may just be my ignorance, I'm not 100% certain what the purpose of that would be. You can still pet your Spectrobes and love on them all you like, really. Like the first game, you can also change your Spectrobe's custom parts here, and this time there isn't a quantity, so you can have as many of the same Spectrobes with the same custom part, which means it's not completely useless, but not entirely helpful in my opinion. You again can then change the room's typing, and with an input code there is a special room which benefits all types, so nothing much has changed there really. There's also a secondary code which gives you some more rooms, so that's convenient, but again, not entirely necessary, though it doesn't hurt. Beyond that, incubators don't serve too much purpose in this game. You thankfully don't have to put your Spectrobes in the incubator for them to evolve. Instead, they're replaced by every Spectrobe having a level requirement, a required battle count, and both of which I'm perfectly fine with on a casual level. Getting all of the evolved forms through this, though, unfortunately, is something that's very time-consuming, so I opted for the route of getting and using the emulator's cheat to get infinite minerals and evolved minerals. It made it so much simpler. Awakening then is now situated by 3 bars and doesn't require something specifically to awaken in color, which again is a good improvement. Due to the requirement of frequency to achieve a new color, my stream involved some very strange moaning. Everything else is largely the same, which was a system they pretty much nailed on its first go with some quality of life improvements. Overall, this game made an absolute ton of improvements, and if this was the first entry of the series, I honestly think it would have done much better as a whole. Compared to the first, this one was much more fun, and the character design doesn't disappoint. It sets up intrigue into the Deniero system and the Spectrobes world that ultimately doesn't get explored too much, even in the sequels. So, I can't remember if I've stated this already, but Spectrobes is one of the few games that I believe only improved upon each iteration, and only got better. There's some things that were removed that honestly hurt, but overall gameplay is vastly improved in this. So we'll start with the story. Now, it should be noted that there were some different developers who worked on this game. The contradictions in the game's story imply that it's a soft reboot in one aspect and then a sequel as well in another. The game turns from a creature collector a la Pokemon and more of a real-time action RPG like... Well, the best example I can find is something like Scalebound, which is a cancelled Xbox game that should be revived because, well, look at it, it's just cool. Anyways, Genki are the ones who developed the game with such notable titles as Katamari Forever, and I don't recognize any of these titles, but it's a lot. They're no stranger to the series as well, as they helped model characters in the second game, and well, the jump in quality in that game is notable, and in this game too. They look great. Honestly, the visuals are the best aspect of this game in my opinion, and well, they nail the looks the other two established as well. Now let's begin with the story again before delving into the rest of the game. Crux, having disappeared after the second game, is at large and has seemingly begun to launch another invasion of the Deniero system, which becomes an obvious problem with people living there and wanting to still live there. So the NPP is sent out to defend the portals of the Deniero system from Crawl invaders, which makes me think that the NPP have outfitted most patrol cruisers with Dynalium beams. That or more Prismods have been created to help defend against the Crawl. Aldous specifically is missing from this game, so it's possible I think that he's been training the new recruits to take up the helm as Spectrobe Masters and Defenders against the Crawl, though there's nothing to confirm that. Now, while the rest of the NPP is sent out to defend hotspots of the portals, Grant sends Rowland and Gina to Sector W, a portal which apparently doesn't have much activity and is considered lower, which they say is there, but again isn't shown in any cutscenes visually, and until Rowland comments that it's pretty empty and then the portal kind of opens up, it's presumably appearing. Or some other kind of portal opens up, I'm not sure, and absorbs the Paris patrol cruiser, which is the mixture of the NPP standard issue ships and the ancient modification we saw in the last game. After being sucked into the portal, the two are knocked unconscious briefly due to just how fast this ship was sucked into the portal. The pair awaken and they're hovering above a new planet. Gina does some analysis of their new positions and quickly discovers they're not in the Deniero system anymore. The two argue not in any aggressive or vindictive way, but about how their position has changed and how to get back. They receive a distress signal from the planet they're hovering over, as they're being attacked by Crawl. Heroically, the two go to the planet hoping to rescue its survivors, only for Rowland to discover that his Prismod doesn't work on this planet, or rather, just stopped working and thus is no longer able to fight said Crawl. Fearing the Crawl as they are now, the two take shelter within a temple nearby, where they discover survivors and the village leader, Rodice. Rodice notices Komainu, the child Spectrobe that presumably has been following the pair since the first game, and notes that the two therefore must be Spectrum Masters, and notes that the Prismod doesn't work in the KO system, and a new tech known as the Cosmolink must be used. The Cosmolink requires a two-person team, though one of them is considered, I believe, a primary wielder, and the other being a co-master. Rowland, of course, being the primary wielder, as expected, and Gina becoming his co-master. Within the Cosmolink are two Spectrobes already there, and the two use them to defeat the Crawl surrounding the temple, and thus freeing Radice and his people from the temple and letting them move back to the village. Radice then explains a handful of things and makes note of a gigantic Crawl across a bridge, which another Crawl destroyed said bridge. The two defeat the Crawl guarding the bridge and encounter a gigantic Crawl, like Radice mentioned. Albeit a hard-fought battle, the pair end up defeating the gigantic Spectrobe and discover an evolution stone was left behind. Becomes kind of disingenuous as a reward, as you find later like 50 just by searching around. Anyway, the two enter the formerly guarded temple and discover an NPP badge which points towards someone from the Nanaira system having visited in the past, and a glowing Zen fossil which stores a memory of another Spectrum Master who seemingly used the temple to evolve his Spectrobes, a function which the Cruiser Incubator can mimic flawlessly, so overall an improvement of the old tech. When talking to Radice about what to do, he suggests heading to Doldoga to meet with Camtoga, a man who was once the partner of the old Spectrum Master. One thing, strangely, is that everyone refers to the old Spectrum Master as the old Spectrum Master, but I believe he would have been widely as a prevalent figure. No one recalls his name throughout this, which again is a bit confusing, but still. Anyway, the pair head over to Doldoga, a planet composed of a giant forest and on the outset a poison river. In search of Camtoga, they go and talk to Doldoga's leader, Greta, who isn't too pleased with two strangers barging into her house while her daughter is missing. Turns out Greta's looking for Camtoga as well, as the forest has been suffering, as evident by the poison river which we saw earlier, and which had been choking out the life on the planet. Once more, the pair volunteer as the resident Spectromasters of the world and go off into the forest to rescue Salia, Greta's daughter. Entering the forest, they discover Salia trying to fend off Crawl with a stick, something that isn't quite effective, so the pair step in and defeat their attackers. Salia then explains to the two what the forest means, and the tree that she was protecting helps keep the forest and the people of Doldoga safe. It's been weakened, however, as a result of the poison rivers, which have been poisoned once again by the Crawl. After receiving and hearing Salia's request, the three end up defeating the Crawl poisoning waters and relieving the tree, which heals rapidly before showing and revealing a temple, something that likely explains why the tree had these strange abilities. Salia and Greta, then seeing the tree back to its former state, thanks the two, and Salia gives Rallen a peck on the cheek. Naturally, the two enter the temple and explore its ruins, finding another glowing fossil at its entrance, which reveals a second memory. The old Spectrum Master talks to a much younger Greta about a being known as the Sleeping Beast King, what is this system's ultimate Spectrum, supposedly. The two continue to venture down the temple and encounter a drill-headed Spectrobe, which they promptly defeat. The two discover that the Crawl was hiding a secret chamber which contains a strange relic, which glows a bright red, which brings them back to Greta and Salia, and Greta notes that she doesn't remember what the item is, but that she vaguely remembers that it didn't glow so brightly. So the two take it back to Radice on Wytera, and after seeing this is shocked at what they found, which is one of the pieces of the Sleeping Beast King. The flashing glow of it reveals an imminent danger, according to Radice, and that the king will likely need to be awakened again. It then becomes critical in part to their mission to retrieve the remaining relics, but they still need to find Camtoga, which prompts Radice to send them to another planet he'd likely be on, Kogaria. Landing on Kogaria, Rallen and Gina comment that the village area seems abandoned, as there are footprints left in the icy snow. They begin to search for Camtoga and his crew, and eventually enter an ice cavern, with a large seal Spectrobe, which proves their weapons ineffective. A voice calls out and gives the pair two cubes, equipped with axes which do the job and take out the attacking Crawl. Relieved, the two find themselves indebted to Camtoga, and the three rendezvous at Camtoga's tent, in which Camtoga explains that he doesn't believe Rallen and Gina are ready to brave the ruins after witnessing their encounter with the Crawl before, and refuses to tell them about said ruins. This actually pisses off Rallen, who decides he'll find the ruins on his own, and Gina follows behind him, trying to convince him that he should turn around. After walking off in the wrong direction, Gina and Rallen have the ground open up from under them, and they plummet into the earth. Both are mildly hurt, but ultimately unscathed in terms of lasting injuries, and end up finding another fossil containing some memories. Pretty conveniently, admittedly. These memories reveal that as Kemtoga was much younger, he was also pretty reckless and got injured by the crawl, for which he was scolded by his partner, the old Spectrobe Master. After waking up, Kemtoga finds them in the ditch, pulling the pair up, and Rowland fervently apologizes for the way he acted, and then Kemtoga gives them a test. After the test, Kemtoga considers them ready and tells them the location of the ruins, which was actually the way Rowland was headed. So technically Rowland was correct, but still wrong in some ways. Again, the two find and solve the ruins, with a giant three-headed dragon-like crawl guarding another secret door. After defeating it, there's another piece of the Beast King, which is congratulated by Kemtoga, who then gives them another fossil with memories stored in them. These memories reveal Kemtoga and the old Spectrum Master watching an NPP cruiser burn before saving a young Commander Grant, who somehow ended up in this system via a portal. Heading back to Wyterra, Radice stores the new piece, and the two check out Menahat at Kemtoga's recommendation. Menahat is a desert planet, and back on Wyterra, they received a distress signal from an explorer there named Neil, someone who seemed desperate. They enter a camp owned by a prospective miner, Dyrus, who has his workers on a tight leash as revealed later. A bit of a break-off from the story, but the seemingly primary difference between Cyrus from the first two games and Dyrus from this game is that Cyrus believes in the greater good and relinquishes just about anything to help, though he normally finds a way to compensate himself. Dyrus, however, is transfixed on his profits regardless of his workers' safety and the safety of the system. Anyway, back to the story. He lets Rowland and Gina outside the gate to deal with the crawl problem pro bono and rescue Neil. We then see the series' main antagonist, Crux, drop a spear of what appears to be dark energy into the ground and summon forth an ancient crawl in hopes of destroying Menahat. He then cuts back to Neil calling out for help, which the pair respond to and kind of rescue him. He was actually perfectly fine though, in all honesty, and informs the pair of 6 other ruins which can all be activated in one way or another. So to make a long story short, that's exactly what you do. You go around and activate 6 other statues of ruins. And some of Dyrus's men try to stop you at some point and interfere for a while, and you learn more about the Crawl War. The Crawl War being a long conflict between the Crawl and the Chaos Spectrum Masters, in which Chaos suffered heavy losses as we basically only see Kemtoga and the old Spectrum Master left. It's safe to presume that a lot of Cosmo Links were also destroyed during this, and that you and Gina are the last of the Masters in the system. The two also learn that the giant fish crawl we see in a cutscene is part of that conflict with another Spectrobe that resembles a Pegasi. It's slowly also revealed that the 7 runes are effectively a weapon that was used against that giant crawl, and that the speed to draw out said crawl to the trap is helped by the Pegasi, which is called Pegantinum, and in the 7th rune conveniently. This leads to a cool cutscene which cuts in at a certain point, which makes me think that it may have originally been a minigame that they didn't implement. I can't say that for certain though. Anyway, the trap works, but a small giant crawl crawls out. That was one crawl with a K and the second with a C, and they defeat it, which annoys Crux, of course. Meeting back in the work camp, Neil thanks you for your help and recommends visiting Slaso, a planet with a giant tower on it. There's also a cut between traveling back to Wyterra and handing off the new sleeping giant piece to Radice, with Grant, who apparently snuck off from his post in Colon to come to KO, recalling an experiment he did with the crawl back in the day with a mysterious fluid. He ends up making a mistake which he hides from the old Spectrum Master who comes in to check on him. The old Spectrum Master feigns having not seen the experiment, though it becomes clear, however, the sight of the experiment did in fact have a lasting impact on the man. The two then visit Slaso, a planet which is barren and plagued by incredibly strong winds which create a funnel around the planet with the exception of this giant tower. It's entirely possible that Slaso was originally covered entirely with these winds, but the ancients built the tower, possibly obfuscating said winds and creating some tech to do such a thing. The tower is impressive, of course, as it rises above the sky and above the clouds. The two enter the building of the tower and encounter a crawl with a robot inside, which the two fight and which runs away. This retreating is strange, as it's in the very nature of the crawl to fight and die. This exception being the specific crawl and the high crawl, who exhibit greater levels of intelligence. After Gino remarks how strange it is that it retreated, we are confronted by a small robot named Tidy who wakes up and informs us that the crawl we just fought was a friend of his named Scout originally. Thus we begin our trek up the tower via elevators, and it's massive with hundreds of floors, though we only see a handful of similar designs, until we reach the top interfaced with an upgraded version of Scout's crawl than we did at the beginning. He's subsequently beaten, and it's revealed as to the purpose of the tower, as it overlooks Manhattan and its starry atmosphere. The tower is clear of the winds and the sands of Slaso, and the atmosphere is presumably thin but quite breathable there. After the Great Crawl War, the ancients constructed the tower on Slaso to serve as a memorial for the countless Spectrum Masters, ancients, and Spectrobes that had passed during that fight. The game doesn't linger on the propensity, but in a matter of perspective, the Great Crawl War was so horrifying and loss so great that an entire planet needed to be memorialized for the losses they suffered. Anyhow, Gina successfully fixes Scout, and the two robot companions are grateful to be with one another once again. The two then leave and are again given a vision by another fossil that Scout and Tiny had. This not only reveals that the old Spectrum Master knew about what happened with Grant's experiments, but that the old Spectrum Master's name is Crux. In spite of this reveal though, neither Rowland or Gino remark on the fact that they've just learned that this is Crux, which is one of the major plot holes in my eyes, because this would be revolutionary. The fact that you learn that your arch nemesis was once the protector of the world you're now fighting for feels like you would say something about it, right? But they don't. It kind of remedies itself, as just moments later you get Scout's memory data, which reveals, despite being corrupted, that the old Spectrum Master, or Crux, is there and talks to them. Apparently he looks really young in this video though, and it's strange considering that last time we saw him he was a decently aged man. The two then once again head back to Waitera and are told by Radice the location of the last shard of the Sleeping King is on Bahamut, a sweltering planet which is rife with volcanic activity and even has several large satellites that spin around in a ring pattern that are also consumed in flames. This heat is likely due to its proximity to the sun, though we're informed it wasn't always this bad, as the ancients originally used a heat as an energy source. Just before entering the ruins, the two are almost assassinated by a sword which flies out from presumably nowhere, when Kemtoga, who agreed to rendezvous with them earlier, manages to get them out of the way and save the pair. Kemtoga calls out, and Crux reveals himself, mocking Kemtoga's attitude largely being the same when they had last saw each other. Then he disappears into the shadows. The three largely brush the encounter off as strange and move onward into the temple. Our main pair then proceed to look down this giant hole which leads to the bottom of said temple, but are once again saved by Kemtoga, who is punched off a cliff by a crawl and plummets to the bottom of it presumably. After the two then defeat the crawl who did the shoving of Kemtoga, they make hopeful remarks of his safety, despite having presumably plummeted over a couple of stories. Steadily the two make their way down and find Kemtoga's body collapsed and encounter a strange beast on all fours with powerful claws, wings made of flesh, and a bulbous tail, which acts as a weight point. I'm not even sure what animal to describe this as or compare it as, but it's a gigantic crawl essentially. Another fight ensues and the two defeat the giant crawl. They manage to wake up Kemtoga, who reveals he'd used a grappling hook to catch him as he fell, lessening the damage, and the pair grab the last shard of the Beast King. They then turn to see Crux, who is said to not be the real one, as Grant shows up at the bottom of the temple very dramatically and tells us after analyzing Scout's video that we'd apparently sent him, it obscured Crux's face. The face belonged to an incredibly young Crux, which didn't look like it had aged or belonged to the one who had faced us in Anira, so it must be a fake. We then see a second Crux arrive, taking off his mask and revealing the Crux that we know. He then belittles the others before we get back a flashback of when Grant's about to leave back to Nairo, and Crux argues that he can use the mysterious fluid from the experiments to gain the abilities of the Crawl and fight back against them. Obviously that didn't work, and the Crawl fluid corrupted his mind. The fake Crux then begs to let him finish the two off, and after removing the mask, it's revealed that the fake Crawl was in fact Jado all along, who's then killed by Crux for his failures. Crux then decides to set off the volcano in hopes of killing everyone, but lo and behold, we make a successful escape with a bit of dramatic will or won't Camtoga and Grant survive after a bridge collapse. With the final piece of the Beast King, we head back to Whiterra, where Radice informs us that the Beast King can be awoken in the Pool of Awakening, which is being guarded by a handful of Crawl, and when we're about to place the last piece, we're stopped by none other than Jado. Hoping to earn himself the respect of Crux again, something he never had but keeps insisting he does, he's defeated and makes a very grand speech about humiliation and how defeated he is, as Crux plans to destroy the planet using some asteroids. Jado whines as he flies up, hoping to receive some mercy, while Rylan and Gina place the final shard, awakening the sleeping Beast King and saving Whiterra. This ends up destroying Jado, but Jado doesn't stay down, so it's likely he's not actually dead, just incredibly maimed and injured. We then return to Radice's home, where we find Camtoga and Grant safe and sound. The five now make a plan to destroy the Crawlosphere, and Rylan and Gina get some answers from Grant as to why he was acting so strange. After that all settled, the two set off to the Crawlosphere and begin the final fight, battling through more and more difficult ways to crawl in the Crawlosphere, which tries to reject them like they were a virus. The conclusive fight is, of course, with Crux and a much more compact Crawl, which is more like a leader type from what I can see, but acts as the heart of the Crawlosphere. After winning the fight, the Crawl, or something inside Crux, launches him back and into the heart of the Crawlosphere. Gina and Rylan then argue as to how to activate the sleeping Beast King, and Rylan convinces Gina to get the ship, while he awakens the Beast King. The King awakens and Rylan stands at the heart of a frozen Crawlosphere, which begins to collapse, and as Rylan begins to fall to his death, he's saved by Camtoga, Grant, and Gina, who are in Grant's patrol cruiser, and manage to escape, and thankfully they're both alive. Everyone then meets back at Radice's place, which seems to be where all the cool kids hang out, so everyone gives their touching farewells, and we head back to Nairo, having given the Cosmolinks to Radice for those ready to become the next Spectrum Masters of the next generation. The three NPP officers head home, which was the last we ever saw of the pair. With the exception of a mobile game I can't seem to find much info on, or much I can find on it. Apparently it had something to do with space pirates, but that's besides the point. Also, quick theory here, with the introduction of KO, Geos have a lot of possible lore implications. Through all three games, there's only two Geos we get without Crux's portals, which are Tindera and KO. My current theory is that each of the Geos are meant to protect a system like Nairo, or the KO system, with Tindera being Nairo's protector and KO being the KO system's defender. That leaves 6 Geos without a system to protect, which follow considering that Crux has supposedly destroyed several systems, including Fubuki, Hakuba, Kagero, and Giorna. Placing some of the Geos with the galaxies, we could say that Fubuki belonged to Artseza, as Fubuki means blizzard, and Arteza is the Ice Geo. Shula likely belonged to the Hakuba system, since Hakuba meaning graveyard, and Shula being a much darker ultimate spectrum, and Kagero likely belongs to Zorna given its planet's atmosphere. I can't assume that any of the Geos belong to Giorna, however, as we know nothing of the planet's atmosphere or the system. Should the games ever make a return, it'd be really fascinating to see a concept realized in a similar function with each system receiving its own Geo. Now, gameplay notes. Gameplay-wise, again, I really feel like this game's action RPG, commanding the Spectrobes and fighting alongside them is great fun. The game is somewhat held back, though, by the Wii's control scheme, but beyond that, it was fine. Since it's a different genre altogether, I can't say one's objectively better than the other, but I do enjoy fighting more in this game. Music is much better in this game, taking a rock genre and is peppered throughout the game perfectly. It's also thankfully present in the fossil minigame, which is shocking. It took them 3 games to realize that they should put music where you're going to be spending the most time in. What's even crazier is technically it took an entirely new developer to make said change. But let's begin the breakdown. The overworld in this game is no surprise the best. Utilizing the Wii's more powerful hardware, they were able to make much more robust and detailed environments. Now, while the game on the surface appears to be open world, it is broken up into zones a la Monster Hunter's earlier titles, in which you roam about and load from zone to zone. It's a flawed system, but it worked and it made for some really pretty looking environments. The only problem is moving speed feels lacking, and I don't know if games with run buttons make me feel better, like I'm moving faster, even if it isn't by much, but it would have felt nice here. They do kind of remedy this again later in the game with Pagantinum, that runs decently fast, but arrives fairly late in the game and has some restrictions on its movement. Pagantinum also has some overworld effects with these light bridges, which only Pagantinum can cross, and normally reveals weapons of different varieties. Another change is in the fact that you can find minerals on the overworld, which searching are now again in colors, but aren't restricted to properties. You also get the stone cubes, which can hold fossils, and unfortunately can also hold minerals, which sucks because it always lists them as mystery pods, which is code for a new fossil you've never seen, and checking it just to be a mineral is kind of annoying. There's also these gears you can earn and train your Spectrobes with, but I'm not sure how it works exactly. It occasionally levels up the Spectrobes, which might be an EXP thing, or it might be just an RNG factor. The overworld feels nicer, but at the same time kind of barren, but doesn't really subtract from the game if you're just playing it to play it. Excavation is the shortest it's ever been, and unlike the other games, you don't spend anywhere near as much time here. You excavate mystery pods, which either contain fossils or a mineral. You don't need too much to mine, and there's no buyable tools because you have bomb, hammer, drill, blower, scanner, and laser, which each serve a kind of obvious purpose, and so I won't really get into them. The only real complexity that excavating here is based off Rowland's level, which we'll go into further on the battle portions next, but with mining you're given a rank from A to E. Based on that rank you get an excavation and get a higher level spectrum, so A provides the highest and E the lowest. Now the problem with this comes in its foundations, because there's no reason why you don't just mine at the highest level and abandon your old Spectrobes, which doesn't sit well with me. While yes, you get EXP for your Spectrobes through battling, I don't think it's a split well between the Spectrobes and your choice of Rowland and or Gina. I.e., you complete a fight that awards 6k EXP, and this split between 6 Spectrobes gets you 1,000 for each, but your choice of character is awarded with the full 6,000. It's a personal taste, though, and again, just means a little more grinding is needed if you want to keep your OG Spectrobes. Now, battle, which I feel is the best in this game and where it really shines, you've got a return to a system like Spectrobes 1, where you can control Rowland and or Gina with a Spectrobe by your side. However, the command of the Spectrobe sending it out to attack, call it back, and switch them out for 5 other battles adds a different complexity to it. The call it back and the switching of Spectrobes is used to avoid different attacks, and sending them out to attack is the most effective way to get your Spectrobes to actually attack, of course. Mixing and matching these 3 commands make up your entire battle strategy for the most part with the Spectrobes. As for your fighting, you have different weapons, each of which have movesets, and different legendary weapons that can be earned by simply interacting and finding them, really. It really makes you feel involved, and I feel, again, it's the best system so far, and there's one minor issue with Spectrobe AI, though, mostly relying on you to send it out to attack, which, yes, is part of the gameplay, but I'd love for them to have acted more on their own, in my opinion. There are several other factors like charge moves, which fill up via attacking, taking damage, and yellow orbs that drop when a crawl die. You've also got these hidden abilities which add different effects, the best being, in my opinion, Rokazoa, which heals it and its user when they attack. A great way to heal before the final boss fight. Quick note, this has nothing to do with anything really, but the final boss for some reason doesn't give you any wiggle room, and you're just kind of thrown into it, so I went into the fight just before thinking, alright, I'll heal and save after this fight before the final boss. Except when that battle ended, I got thrown into the final boss fight with 2 Spectrobes, and when I went to load for my last save, it was 2 bosses before said final boss. I was devastated, and despite that, it was best to redo those 2 fights and come back later. Possibly my fault, that wasn't also a great design choice though. Incubators in this game are the most fun as you get to directly interact with them and you get to see all kinds of personalities within your Spectrobes. You also get to see just how massive they can get, and well, the system is less complicated here as the other games, but you get to see and interact and just be in it, and it's honestly my favorite iterations. I just wish the system was a bit more in-depth, but I love it all the same. Awakening is, well, the weakest here. It's basically Shake the Wiimote and Nunchuck, but there isn't alternate colors that aren't from card inputs, which I think is something that the game really missed out on. So in conclusion, I think the game was the best in combat, a great story, and some really interesting characters with a bunch of lore implications that aren't entirely explained, but would be neat to see and expanded possibly in the future. Overall, the gameplay continued to improve over time with each iteration, and I think it could have been better obviously, like all games. The first 2 had the most Spectrobes, and I think the second utilized the quality of them better. But the third had the most comprehensive designs, and I think applying those retroactively, adding those changes to possible future entries would be a good idea. I like the friendship system in 1, and that's the one clever thing I think I can say that the game had better than the others, and think that it could make a turn. A lot more high crawl I think would be an improvement, as Maya and Jado are kind of highlights of the series, and I'd love to see the crawl with the new properties we're missing. I.e. a plant property, as personally Gronos feels more like an earth property high crawl, in my opinion, and a sky property. And whatever properties they add in the future. Dark Spectrobes need to make a return. While stronger, I'd love to see them look with more visual differences, though beyond just being darker color palette, and get some more of the crawl influence, like some new horns, more teeth kind of thing, as well as giving it a better reason as to why they're naturally stronger than other Spectrobes. But that's just my personal opinion. Incubators like 3 were the best, but needed more in-depth mechanics, i.e. the friendship, and maybe some passive leveling as well as the adult and evolved Spectrobes, maybe transferring abilities or teaching stats. Somehow I can't say for sure, but it still needed something. Battling I like for it to be the style of Origin, with 2 Spectrobes out that you switch between giving commands to. Also, controller controls, it's hard to use the Wiimote in my opinion, and a little fickle. Obviously they wouldn't be using the Wii though, because, well, obvious reasons. Again, this series had, and still has, the potential to be one of the best with such little effort. I'd love for either Disney to sell off the property or hell another studio to make it a property in essence similar to the series. All in all, the games were constantly improving and the designs were constantly great. And well, it died on the vine before it really got its foot in the door. In large part, in my opinion, because of Disney's ineffectiveness at promoting the series and developing it. It seemed they wanted a game series, but didn't want all the hassle that a game series came with, like promotions, some actual merchandise beyond a stylus, and some shirts. Again, this series could have been great, but it died, and it should make a comeback in some shape or form. So the books are an insight to the actual personalities of Gina and Rowan, as well as their moralities. There's also clarification on just how dangerous the threat of the Crawl are within the books. These are, of course, scholastic-type books, which have big fonts and not a lot of content, but it exhibits some pretty decent writing. So the books were written by Ned Lur, a pen name, and there were supposed to be only 4, except the 4th was never released, so there's 3. An excerpt of the 4th, however, was released 13 years after the last game and the last book. Anyway, the first really shines through with giving us introspective into Gina's character, and the fact that she begrudgingly kinda is pulled around by Rowan. As smart as she is, she can't exactly control Rowan, and takes jabs at his expense a lot. Rowan's personality is more or less what you'd expect from the hero archetype, but it's just surprising how much he's dedicated to his newfound cause in this. The main thing that surprises me about the books is just how much it sets up the Crawl as a threat and the vortexes as well, which don't come across as well in the game. The Crawl are portrayed as creatures easily capable of killing Rowland in every encounter he gets into, and even the inside of the vortexes themselves are hostile. The Whip Crawl, or Swar that we see commonly, which Rowland first encounters, are strong enough to whip off flesh. Rowland in one encounter barely avoids losing his ear, apparently. The winds within the vortex are also described as harsh and howling, with the barbed wire-like constructs around them being capable of ripping him apart easily, which makes less sense in the game as you actively run towards them. So yeah, what you're constantly running towards are effectively spinning buzzsaws. Rowland is a madman. Aldous also comes off more as a man who's lost his planet and, well, everyone he knows, as he's not in the slightest bit interested in the beginning with Gina and Rowland's banter. With a goal of setting up Rowland to be a Spectrum Master, most of the first book takes place on the first planet Daichi, and the second on Genshi, with a couple of pit stops on Nessa. We're also introduced to several characters such as Max, a mechanic who works for the NPP, and Smurray, the character I mentioned earlier. It's a weird name and gets me questioning how people are actually named in the Naira system, but he's a boy that Rowland ends up hanging out with for a couple moments as they're evacuating Nessa. Rowland actually seems to really get a bond with the kid as he ends up hanging out with the Spectrobes, and he'll be relevant in a somewhat later part of the video again. Also, Professor Kate takes a surprisingly more prominent role compared to her iterations in the game. She actually ends up traveling with Rowland and Gina for quite some time, learning about the Spectrobes and the Crawl as a whole. Genshi again is primarily explored in this book, and it's more in-depth as to what the atmosphere is like there. Genshi is primarily a magma planet, and the magma runs close enough to the surface that the ground is constantly warm, apparently. The air also smells like sulfur, and is generally hard to breathe, something Rowland learns while fighting on the planet, and just existing on it, even collapsing at times. Aldous also, well, he's in the book at a point, but doesn't really provide much to it other than some words of encouragement and info on Rowland's new Spectrobes Ioba. We're also given mentions of two of the game's most prolific antagonists, Jado and Crux, though they're not given much to do in the plot. Before delving into the third book, it should be noted that the previous book features Gina on the cover with a laser sword, but she never actually uses one or fights in this. Finally, the third book skips past the rest of the plot of the second games and puts us in the start of the third game in the KO system, with Rowland and Gina encountering Waitera, and surprisingly, this book is the most accurate of the series to its game counterpart. In it are the first four planets, substitute Waitera, Doldoga, which I think may be closer to Daichi, Kogaria acts as a substitute for Himura and Hyoga, and Manahat the Nessa counterpart. The beginning starts with us at the NPP officer headquarters, where Commander Grant wishes to address the whole of the NPP about the threat of the Crawl. When Rowland and Gina are asked to address the crowd with their experience with the threat of the Crawl, it turns out Rowland has a fear of public speaking and ends up botching the presentation, likely making most of the NPP dismiss the actual severity of the Crawl. Now, at the beginning, they of course are sent to Sector W's portal and are given the Cosmo links in the game, but in this version, however, Gina is hesitant to join Rowland as his partner. She casts doubts on herself, and Radice ends up agreeing that they might need a different partner. Rowland quickly makes a quick and harsh remark to Radice after such a suggestion. Eventually, Gina agrees to put on the other part of the Cosmolink, and with Rowland's help starts developing skills as a Spectromaster, something that Rowland seems to try to ensure that she's more than capable of handling. Now, there's a jump in one of the chapters, which I'm not sure whether they're on Doldoga or Waitera, but I think the implication points more so towards Doldoga, and they find Grant's NPP badge in a cave house rather than the temple in the game. Along with this confusion, there's another which I think implies that the NPP badge also functions as holographic communication device, though I could be wrong and there was a computer terminal within said house. The two, after exiting the cave, are confronted by Greta, who isn't too happy at the two's presence, and is actually a lot more dismissive of the two than she was in the game, reluctantly implying that Camtoga might be in the forest at the Tree of Life. The two then see Salia in distress like before and defeat the Crawl. This time, however, it's the Crawl in front of the tree that are actually causing poisoning, and once they die, it fixes itself. Salia thanks the two like last time, and Rowland blushes once again like a tomato, which Gina wants to tease him for before she notices the temple underneath the tree. When entering the temple, though, she makes up for the lost time and teases Rowland about Salia, before Cornelia again runs off, finding a shard piece and the glowing fossilized Zenny. Rowland, of course, touches these Zenny fossils and receives the vision of young Crux, or as referred to earlier, the old Spectromaster, and a young Greta talking to one another and recites a poem. He talks about the sleeping Beast King and the 5 shards within the 5 sites, of which they've located the first piece. The two bring the shard back to Greta, who reveals she remembers it, and the red glow is quite strange. And the two leave, heading back to the ship. Now, it's never revealed that Greta and Salia are daughter and mother in this game, though in the ship they're contacted by a fellow NPP officer, Harry, who recounts a story in which an NPP officer disappeared in the W sector in the past, which of course was Grant. So the two then return to White Terra, and Radice, knowing that the glow implies a threat, is mortified by the possibility that the omen brings. With a new implied goal of gathering Beast King shards, they head towards the ice planet Kogaria. The two run into a similar ambush of Crawl and are thrown cubes by an off-screen Camtoga, who instead of giving them axes, gives them the Cosmo Shield in this iteration, and they use that to defeat the Crawl. Just like in the games though, Camtoga ruthlessly lays into the pair about their skills. Something that should be noted though is that Gina wants to argue back with Camtoga, but states she feels calmer as she sees Rowland's also annoyed. Rowland and Camtoga once again argue, and Rowland storms off, eventually causing both him and Gina to plummet into the gorge below. The two recover, and you get the same vision of Camtoga having rushed off ahead and being scolded by his partner after touching the memory fossil, and again a rescue by Camtoga. The game then kinda quickly runs through Menahat and Slaso, and doesn't add much other than saying that Crux summoned the fish on Slaso, which is obviously an error as it's summoned on Menahat. And then there is a teaser for the 4th book at the end of the 3rd book, which hasn't been released in 13 years, and probably never will. Now, bringing up the webisodes, touching on the webisodes, they don't add much other than visuals to some of the things that we've already touched on within other games. We end up seeing several things though, such as Crux's palace, a training area for pilots, and Maya's utilization of her hair. Most curiously though, we see Gina doing some excavation of custom parts, and some more of Professor Kate. We also come to realize that the white armaments on Rowland's and the rest of the NPP suits, for that matter, are modular and can be taken off. There's nothing too crazy revealed in the webisodes, but it's best to touch on them for the sake of the whole thing. Should anyone want to somehow redevelop this series, there's 2 ways I can see it going. One of 2 ways, and hell, I'll even include what I kinda think a story could look like. Option 1, I'd like to think it would be an online MMO style of game. Nothing like FF14 or Warframe, but similar in style to Scalebound and with a cel-shaded style more akin to what it is now. The change obviously would be strange, but I think it could work well in my opinion. So let's start with the combat, as that'd need the most fine-tuning. Also established right off the bat, you're not playing as Rowland and Gina anymore, which may be controversial opinion, but I feel that obviously it works better for an online RPG, and would help establish the NPP as a multiplanetary and dimensional force. I mean, let's be honest, we've seen a handful of people and collaborators working for the NPP, but no real officers. Also, with a minor to large time jump, we can begin to explain how everyone in the NPP has Cosmo Links and Prismods after it became necessary equipment. Spectrobes would have also been integrated into the day-to-day lives of civilians like the Ancients used them for, as they were described like in Doniphan's description. Rowland and Gina would be teachers or the leading experts in Spectrobes, and while taking part in the story would focus on leading the NPP to victory behind the scenes. Alright, back to combat. I lost focus there for a second. Combat would be more akin to Origins, with a mixture of the first game, which, as much as I hate it, I could have some good ideas behind it. Like the first 2 games, you'd be in the command of 2 Spectrobes, and like the first in Origins, you'd also control Rowland. Spectrobes would be controlled by AI, and one at a time having the ability to be issued commands by your NPP officer. So imagine Origin-style combat, but with 2 Spectrobes at your side, and the ability to switch between which Spectrobe you order. I feel like it's imperative that the lineup system also makes a return, and you can't change your lineup while in combat. Why? Because the old lineup system adds strategy to the game, and would make PvP situations much better. PvP, yes, PvP would be a thing, and how you'd implement it, I believe, are called NPP training exercises. The NPP to combat the crawl needed the best officers possible and would therefore have sparring matches against one another, with a ranking system and everything. Now let's discuss who you're fighting obviously first. And foremost is the Crawl, the baddies from every game who've come back and actively fight the NPP, trying to destroy the Nairo system once again. A new type of opponent is the Rogue Masters, a group of Spectrobe losers who believe in Crux's goal, and dream. They use Spectrobes to fight against the NPP and adds a variety and Spectrobes on Spectrobe combat outside of PvP. You also then have Wild Spectrobes, as prevalent as they've become, and since they don't feel as threatened by the Crawl, something that was mentioned in the books, and I'm sure somewhere else in the games, as the reason why they're fossils. Wild Spectrobes are also tameable, but there's got to be some system of which I haven't worked out yet. Like any good game, there's also going to be bosses, obviously being a mixture of High Crawl, Leader Crawl, and the heads of the Rogue Master organization. That's the long and short of combat, without delving into too many ideas, which is why we're moving on to Excavation. Excavation is something that I'm personally trying to balance as well. We'll start with the views on fossils, which would be akin to Origins system, again, in which you go and excavate fossils by the block before being actually excavated in the ship. Minerals will also follow the same system like they had in Origins, being given to you on the surface, but with the colors being the predominant factor like Beyond the Portal. Awakening is a separate matter that I guess I will also be covered here as well, because it doesn't warrant its own section. There'd still be the normal 3 color types, the normal 1 and 2 custom colors, and a 4th type which would effectively act as a shiny and would be decently rare. I'd also propose another system to further set each Spectrobe and fossil apart, a color grade system. In games with customization, you normally can get pretty radical colors by using a slider system for one's own look. This system would give Spectrobes a slider on 3 distinct parts of their bodies, i.e. the eyes, body, and prominent features, to give different saturations and tint. An illustrated example we use is Komodo, whose body in this normal state is red, and no matter how many times you awaken in the previous games, you'll always get the same red. This game, you'll be able to awaken one in the normal color state, but you'll see the saturation change on its body, setting the Spectrobes apart from one another. This system was briefly used in Warframe, a game that I'm not exactly too familiar with, but had a system with these things called Cobros, in which you could pull for various colors, though it was removed due to how microtransaction heavy it was, and was abused for whale-like behavior, something that the company didn't like. Rather than a microtransaction system, this would just be a natural part of the game to add variety to the Spectrobes, alongside the custom parts. Moving on to said custom parts, I think they should also be made rarer and harder to find, and a little more difficult to transfer. Moving back to Spectrobes 1 and the usage system in which you only have a limited amount, so 1 custom part equals 1 custom part. In this system, it would be possible to have a Spectrobe with a custom part, a rare color, and a rare saturation to give it some complexity. Overall, this system would reward individuals for continual excavation of the same Spectrobe species as to minimize any sort of repetitiveness. Gameplay-wise, you can keep the planetary part of the exploration, though you'd obviously need to set up larger planets, or at the very least larger areas within said planets to explore. Populate the Nairo system with towns, settlements, cities, and of course NPCs. NPCs will play a much more valuable part in this system as opposed to the previous titles, as they'll serve to flesh out Spectrobe's history and lore, something that hasn't been quite explored in any facet, i.e. I'd like to explore the ancients through the eyes of the NPCs, as well as the colonization of the planets, as according to novels, Daichi is one of the most populated planets, having what looks like to be the second most appealing atmosphere after Colon, but at the same time, Colon seems like it would be too crowded to be all that comfortable. As you'd follow along the story and gain Spectrobes, minerals, gear, and quest would begin to become an integral part of the game, dealing from warding off Crawl from location to location, gathering relics that belong to the ancients, and delivering Spectrobes to a new master. The gameplay loop would be in ways similar to Temtem, a game which brought about the ideas of the MMORPG foray into my mind, and you'd get Spectrobes, raise them, and fight baddies, that type that's emblematic of creature collectors. There'd also be expansions, of course, involving various planets, getting new areas to explore and new systems. Preferably, there'd be small expansions which would add less, but serve to pump the game with fresh blood, so to speak, a la sets of new Spectrobes that are constantly being discovered, at least for the sake of being consistent with lore. Larger expansions would introduce new systems through portals in which Crawl have begun to invade the MPP, assisting the system's respective forces to repel them, and it would help introduce new Spectro species, even variations of the older species. The point is to help diversify the strategy indefinitely, along with making for some interesting fights. I'd also make some minor adjustments to the list of elements that Origins had, with new properties such as Clear or this game's version of Normal, Typing, and Dark to help revitalize Dark Spectrobes as a concept. Of course, I'm just prattling about the game, but haven't made anything too clear because I'm not too clear on it myself. A second type of game would be a single-player focused experience revolving around Rowland and Gina, much more grown up than we saw them in Origins. As usual, the Crawl have returned and are fiercer than ever, as a new Crawlosphere has appeared and all the NPP are fighting against it. The game would revolve around teaching and helping NPP officers on the different planets become Spectrum Masters like Rowland and Gina in order to launch an assault against Crux's forces. While simpler in nature, the game would provide a much better story and a much more focused gameplay experience in my mind. Certain features such as the slider color idea I think could be passed in exchange for a much more robust selection of Spectrobes and a much more detailed world. PvP and scope would also need to be reassessed. This one isn't as thought out though, due to the fact that its systems would largely be similar to the MMO proposal, with a more focused scope on the outset of the Nairo system rather than updating the game and expanding on it from there. As for the story, there's two versions, but we'll settle with the MMO's version because telling two stories might delude the first one. A warning alarm begins to blare throughout NPP's headquarters. A young commander watches as reports have begun to flood throughout the system as Crawl have begun to emerge. A message from Crux calls out to the Nairo system as a whole, that he's done playing around with them. He reveals an army of Leader and High Crawl around him that he's brought over from distant systems, including Jado, standing as his right hand. He encourages Nairo to give it their all, as he's ready to do just the same. Once again, Nairo's planetary headquarters is under attack, and we cut to the cadets' training room, in which you'd customize your character and choose one of 5 child Spectrobes for each of the properties. With the exception of Clear and Dark, since they wouldn't be as prominent for cadets training. You're then tasked with the escaping and or reaching a rendezvous point that the young commander has set. You'd be tasked with doing this alongside either a partner you'd create, or, in my opinion, Smurray, a boy in the books that Rowland knew and had an aptitude with Spectrobes again. Once you escape using a training weapon, you're then confronted by Jado, who looks down on you and would likely remark that his shadow would eagerly consume you. Losing a fight to Jado handedly, he then reels back to consume you before 2 Spectrobes interfere in your fight, knocking the wind out of Jado. Gina and Rowland tell Jado to leave or there will be more consequences, and Jado of course retreats, commenting that he'd just been caught by surprise and that the Crawls won't lose this time. Rowland brings you and your partner to the rendezvous location where the rest of the cadets are gathered. Rowland looks to a team who've been somewhat trained as Spectrobe Masters, though they're not skilled as everyone else is off-world. He looks to you and comments that you held off on your own against a high Crawl, and asks if you and your partner would be willing to assist in taking back NPP headquarters, offering you 2 adult Spectrobes from his reserves, and gives your partner 2 as well. You're then tasked with fighting back, and that of course is your tutorial area with the Spectrobes, as you learn about them and help evacuate stragglers. You then confront a Leader Crawl with your partner somehow managing to take it down, and the 2 of you collapse out of exhaustion and are awakened in an infirmary. Gina, now a captain of the NPP, tells you that you've done well and that she and Rowland need to go off planet, and is temporarily making you an officer to assist with the fight, but only on call-in. You then get a mix of exploration and more general tutorial type levels until ultimately you'd be made an official officer sent to help gather forces to help launch an attack on Crux. You'd of course do such learning about the Ancients, the fate of Aldous, and why Maya and possibly Gelbrus have decided to betray Crux and reluctantly assist Gina and Rowland. Eventually, a final confrontation would happen with you and Rowland fighting together to defeat Crux once and for all. Eventually repelling him and defeating him, so to speak, and imprisoning him so that the NPP can keep an eye on him. It's a pretty straightforward type of story, but honestly, the twists and turns of Spectrobes can only go so far as the lore available allows them to. And given how shallow it is, that would be a hard sell. Then future expansions, however, would open up new systems to explore where high crawl have been sent to maintain the rule of certain systems while Crux is absent. We'll call these Ascended Crawl, to create something that the high crawl aren't. That's just something that, again, that's basic and definitely skips a lot of what is possible within this franchise. Sustaining this would easily be possible, though on its outset, of course, it would be expensive. Disney published the games with no real prospects of merchandise or seemingly a plan. They put out small keychains and a handful of webisodes, but didn't put any real backing behind the property. Perhaps a new web-based show would work now, especially given the modern era of streaming and all that. And depending on its production value, could do well with merchandising. You've got Pokemon-esque appeal, and when it comes to creature collectors, think of it. Spike-in figures, enamel pins, and pins based off the badge sets of the Beyond the Portal series, and a cute little Sabo plush. Full honesty, I intended to get a little plush of Sabo as an example, but it's hella expensive to get one that look half decent. You get the point though. The game needed supplementary material beyond the books to help draw people into the games. Pokemon is the most profitable intellectual property, and while it needs more competition, this being an opportunity, and it could have done so much if the company behind it would have actually backed it. It's a series that died in the hands of its company, in my opinion, and not on the game merits. So that's Spectrobes. Beyond my illustrated point of what a potential future could be, we still have no idea what Disney actually intends to do with the property, if anything at all. It still lays dormant, and it could be exciting to see them revitalize it. As of recording this, the D23 of 2022 has passed, and there was no announcement, so of course we have no idea if anything is even on their mind with the series. But I look forward to seeing Spectrobes in the future if it ever makes a return.
So this is the end of the video. If you made it this far, I greatly appreciate it. As I said, this is the first of hopefully many retrospectives, and I really appreciate anyone who's sticking around and watched this far. So thank you so much. I'll see you later. Carver, out.